Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment. I actually recorded this for the podcast before I ever did YouTube, so there is a version of this that exists out there on the podcast side of things, but I am now re-recording this episode for YouTube, so YouTube, this one is for you. Now, I'm pretty sure that just about anyone who has ever dipped their toe into psychology has heard about this silly little experiment over at Stanford, but some of you may not know the extensive details that led up to the failure that is the Stanford Prison Experiment. It gets really crazy, really fast, but don't worry, that's why you have me. I am going to be your tour guide, and I am here to enlighten you on everything crazy that happened. So buckle up, Buttercup, and enjoy the ride. The Stanford Prison Experiment, also known as the Zimbardo Prison Experiment, took place in August of 1971 at Stanford University. No surprise there, that's kind of what the experiment is named after. The experiment was designed to be a 2-week simulation of a basic prison environment. The goal was to examine the effects of situational variables on participants' reactions and behaviors, whether they were a guard or prisoner. The experiment was run by Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Zimbardo was in charge of managing the research team. The research team, in turn, was in charge of administering the study. In the end, Zimbardo cut the experiment short after realizing the guards and the other, I guess you would say, administration, became raging power-hungry assholes. This is an interesting statement, and you'll see why later, because Zimbardo himself was very much one of those raging power-hungry assholes. Now, in order to gain participants for the experiment, a $15 daily payment was offered. I did some math, and that would be about $116 in today's currency, which isn't great, but sometimes you just need a little extra cash on the side, so it is what it is. With a promise of $15 a day, Zimbardo turned to the local newspapers and placed ads requesting participants who would be screened for the experiment. Interestingly enough, the ad targeted young men and requested only male participants, so at least us ladies can say that we weren't really a part of this shit show of a study. So, go girls, that is a win in our box. We can have a little pizza party later if you guys would like. In total, 24 participants were chosen to participate in what was advertised as a, quote, psychological experiment of prison life, end quote. These 24 candidates were consequently screened and assessed for psychological stability because that is very important for the way the experiment was conducted. They were then assigned randomly to the role of prisoner or prison guard. As you may have guessed, critics of Zimbardo's experiment have questioned the validity of these screening methods. Once we dive into the experiment itself, you'll see why people weren't exactly comfortable with the way that Zimbardo did things. But what was the goal of this experiment? What did Zimbardo want to learn through all of this? Well, the official SPE website, which stands for Stanford Prison Experiment website, states the designated goal was, quote, we wanted to see what the psychological effects were of becoming a prisoner or prison guard. To do this, we decided to set up a simulated prison and then carefully note the effects of this institution on the behavior of all those within its walls, end quote. Pretty straightforward in theory, probably one of the easiest ways to explain the experiment's goal. However, a 1996 article from the Stanford News Service elaborated on the experiment goal, stating, quote, Zimbardo's primary reason for conducting the experiment was to focus on the power of roles, rules, symbols, group identity, and situational validation of behavior that generally would repulse ordinary individuals, end quote. Zimbardo is then quoted as stating, I had been conducting research for some years on de-individualization, vandalism, and dehumanization that illustrated the ease with which ordinary people could be led to engage in antisocial acts by putting them in situations where they felt anonymous, or they could perceive of others in ways that made them less than human, such as enemies or objects, end quote. So that's kind of Zimbardo's more elaborated stance for why he was conducting the experiment. Basically, Zimbardo, what he liked to study was kind of the bystander effect, but also the bystander effect within crime itself, which is interesting. It's an interesting concept. I just think he really sucked at doing research to look at this. As for funding, the experiment was supported by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, United States Navy, and the United States Marine Corps. I'm not exactly sure why the government was so invested in all of this, but I do suspect it would aid them in studying human behavior and then adapting their own systems to gain further compliance from subordinates and prisoners. Again, that's just my speculation, but it is a little bit weird that the government was so eager to back an experiment like this. As mentioned before, Zimbardo placed an ad in the Palo Alto newspaper, and after making its way around the local area, he sifted through 75 applicants and then settled on a select prime 24. The 24 selected men were predominantly white middle-class men with seemingly normal and stable backgrounds. Men with criminal backgrounds or medical handicaps were rejected from the experiment altogether, including those with mental illness. I'm not sure how accurate that was because 1971, kind of a different time when it comes to mental illness, but whatever, is what it is. He tried at least. In preparation for the experiment, Zimbardo constructed small prison cells designed to hold 3 men each. In all, there was a small corridor that made up the prison yard, a closet used for solitary confinement, and a bigger room across the hall for the guards and a warden. Where Zimbardo built these structures was in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall, taking up a 35-foot section of the basement. The cells themselves were unlit and contained only a small mattress with a thin white sheet for each male participant. Additionally, the prisoners were required to stay on site and were not allowed to leave once the experiment began. They were only allowed in their cells and the recreation yard. Comparatively, those acting as guards were allowed to go home and work in 8-hour rotational shifts. They also had access to special separate areas for relaxation and eating. The guards were instructed to work in teams of 3 throughout the experiment. At face value, it was a pretty faithful reconstruction of what it would look like for a prisoner and a guard in this type of situation. But face value is very different than what actually happened. Now, Zimbardo himself acted as the superintendent and appointed an undergraduate student, David Jaffe, as the warden. David would later be scrutinized for attempting to manipulate the experiment by influencing the guards who worked for him. Big surprise there. Now, before the experiment officially began, there was an orientation for the guards. They were specifically instructed not to harm the prisoners, withhold food and drink, and to simply maintain law and order. Once this was clear, the guards were provided with wooden batons, matching uniforms, and mirrored sunglasses. The guards were also instructed to refer to the prisoners by their designated number and avoid using names. With some of the precursory aspects of the experiment established, we're going to go ahead and jump into the timeline of the experiment. Saturday, August 14th was setup day. The small mock prison cells discussed before were set up, and the participants who had been assigned a guard role attended their designated orientation, where they were briefed and given uniforms, like I said, with batons and sunglasses, and then the experiment officially began. We have Sunday, August 15th, which would be known as Day 1. Those assigned a prisoner role were mock arrested by the local Palo Alto police. They were collected from their homes, jobs, or previously determined sites. And despite knowing that they would be prisoners, the participants were not informed that they would be legitimately arrested for the experiment. Researchers stated this was done to surprise participants and create a sense of realness. This is 100% a violation of people's Fourth Amendment rights. Like, this is a big no-no. This should never have been greenlit or done. And as you may have guessed, this was a breach of ethics in Zimbardo's own contract that all of the participants had signed. So yeah, we're already off to a bad start because Zimbardo, the guy in charge of this entire experiment, broke and neglected his own contract, which is probably not the best, especially on freaking day 1. So we're essentially starting off the experiment with a gigantic red flag. As for the arrest itself, prisoners were charged with armed robbery and burglary. These are heavy crimes in the area, specifically felonies. And the Palo Alto Police Department willingly assisted Zimbardo's team with the simulated arrests by performing full booking procedures on the prisoners. Again, a major violation of every participant's civil rights. Just because you enter an experiment does not mean you suddenly no longer have your rights as an individual. So this is not good. The booking process even took place at the Palo Alto City Police headquarters. All prisoners were read their Miranda warnings, fingerprinted, and had mug shots taken. They were then placed in holding cells and forced to wear blindfolds. Frankly, I'm not entirely sure why a police department would be fine just falsely arresting a bunch of guys and legitimately booking them into a fake prison. But here we are. I guess my expectations are too high given that it's 2026 now and this was in 1971. I think it's ridiculous and I think it's a huge liability, and I don't think a police department could get away with doing that in today's day and age. As if that wasn't bad enough, all of the events taking place were video recorded by a local San Francisco television station. So everybody knows what's happening. That's probably not great. On top of this, the reporter used Zimbardo's personal vehicle. Additionally, many of the participants were arrested in front of family members and neighbors who witnessed spread eagle and aggressive pat-downs. While the prisoners were being booked, 3 of the designated guards prepared for the inmates to arrive. Once the booking process was complete, the prisoners were transported to the mock prison from the police station. Apparently, this was done with lights and sirens, and this doesn't make a lick of sense, because law enforcement doesn't activate emergency lights and sirens unless it's an actual emergency or a designated code run. This was likely done for show and to induce an emotional response on the fake prisoners. But what amazes me is that officers would be willing to run code for an experiment, because every officer knows that when you run code, you're putting yourself at risk and you're putting the public at risk. You can't control what other people are going to do out on the road. It's just an inherently dangerous thing to do, and they have innocent people in their vehicles who aren't actually prisoners, so now they're also putting those people's lives on the line. It's just stupid. It is absolutely stupid. A completely unnecessary risk to take in the, quote, name of science. Now, in the Stanford County Jail, the prisoners were systematically strip searched and given their new identities, inmate identification numbers, along with a uniform. Now, I don't know what the process was like in 1970, but you don't strip search everybody that goes into jail. The way it works when I take people to jail is they get strip searched if they have their body scan done. Obviously, body scan technology was not a thing in the 1970s. I get that. So this may influence what their procedures were. But for me, it's you take them there, and then if they get a body scan done and something looks like a foreign object is in their body, you would do a strip search. Or if somebody comes in and they're a suicide risk, you would do a strip search. Again, 1971 is probably very different than 2026, but I do think it's a little bit weird that, again, we are strip searching innocent individuals. During this process, inmates were also run through delousing procedures. This procedure was done specifically to humiliate the prisoners, as written in a narration of the experiment. As I have mentioned in a couple of different videos, I used to work in the justice system, specifically in juvie, and strip searches are inherently a very traumatizing experiment. It is awkward even for career criminals. I always apologize to people who have to do a strip search, and I explain to them, hey, this is how it is. I am not comfortable with this either. Unfortunately, I don't make the rules. Let's just get this done as quick as we can. Nobody likes being naked in front of a stranger, especially a cop. Now, in juvie, we limit the strip search that are done because it's extra damaging to children. But as I mentioned, it's also traumatizing even for adults, and it's really just overall a very dehumanizing experience. Obviously, strip searches serve a purpose, as I mentioned earlier. If somebody goes through a body scan and they have something in them that they can't bring into the jail, like cocaine or meth, that has to be handled. I, thankfully, have never had to experience a strip search, but I also know for a fact that I would be horribly uncomfortable with it, because I'm also horribly uncomfortable with having to watch somebody else do it. Being naked in general is a very vulnerable thing to do, as I mentioned, let alone being naked in front of a bunch of strangers and people pretending to be cops who aren't cops. It also helps display the power dynamic that these mock prisoners are walking into. It establishes right off the bat that they have no right to privacy, no right to their own bodies, and it makes it very clear that they are at the bottom of the food chain. So that's probably why this step was done. I don't particularly agree with it. As if this didn't make the prisoners uncomfortable enough, they were given ill-fitting smocks without any underwear, which is a little bit weird, and stocking caps made specifically from women's stockings, as well as a chain around one ankle. Though the word smock might be generous if we're being honest, because in the narration of the experiment, the smocks are specifically called, quote, dresses, end quote. Though it doesn't say what the intention of this was, I can assume it was to emasculate the prisoners. So much so that the narration claims the men were observed behaving more like women, walking like women, and being more cognizant of how they sat in their dresses. I think it's probably because they were buck naked under there and didn't have underwear. Not appropriate at all, in my opinion. Because again, these are people who aren't actually prisoners. And I'm going to talk from the juvie experience, the juvie side of things. So the way that juvie works, I've probably mentioned this before, is that all of the clothing has predetermined sizes. And sometimes the best that could be done would be, you have a size that's slightly too small or a size that's slightly too big. And it would be uncomfortable, but the goal was to try and make the kid as comfortable as possible, give them the closest size possible. Like I said, sometimes it was just, unfortunately, this shirt is a little too big or a little too small. Everything was pre-ordered, so there's not much that could be done about that. However, the kids were always given bras and underwear, and police required them to, policy requires them to wear it. And also, as an officer myself, I don't think I've ever been to jail where people have not been allowed to have underwear unless they are on suicide watch. So, again, not appropriate. Might just be that 1971 things were done differently. I don't think that excuses the behavior, especially because, again, these aren't actual criminals. So, just keep that in mind as we go, because it only gets weirder. The way I feel about it is that somebody made this up and was like, oh my god, it would be really cool if we made them wear dresses and they didn't have any underwear. And Zimbardo was like, yeah, that sounds great. And then they included that in the experiment. As for the uniforms themselves, the prisoners had numbers sewn into them that guards were encouraged to use as the prisoner's name. Once the prisoners were changed out, they were introduced to the warden, who we know as Jaffe. Jaffe gave a speech in which he conveyed the seriousness of the prisoners' offense and established their new status as prisoners. After Jaffe informed the prisoners of the prison rules, the inmates retired to their cells for the rest of the first day for the experiment. Personally, I think I would have tapped out of the experiment by now, but I don't know if that was really an actual option for these gentlemen. I think ethically it's a requirement, but ethics weren't really a thing in this experiment, as we'll come to find out. It also wouldn't be a surprise to me if those acting as prisoners felt like they actually couldn't leave, because at this point they've legitimately been arrested, booked, strip searched, and now they're thrown in a cell. So that psychology effect alone could have made it that they legitimately felt they had a complete loss of power, that they actually weren't in an experiment and they weren't free to leave, which I believe was Zimbardo's intended effect. Documents tend to support this, but it's a very concerning thing, especially the fact that this all happened on day one. We move to Monday, August 16th, day 2. Guards referred to prisoners by their identification numbers, as they were expected to, and confined the prisoners to their small cells. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the prisoners reportedly rebelled against the guards' wake-up calls. The guards attempted to wake the inmates by using whistles and clanging batons on cell bars. I'm not entirely sure why the guards wanted the prisoners to wake up at 2:30 a.m., but they did, and the prisoners didn't take it very well, as one would expect. And in order to defy the guards' wishes, the prisoners refused to leave their cells to eat in the yard. 2:30 a.m. feels like a really weird time to eat something, but whatever. So they went on to rip off their inmate number tags, tear off their stocking caps, and threw a plethora of insults at the guards, which honestly kind of makes sense. They also barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds. Mind you, those were just thin mattresses. Quite frankly, I would be pretty pissed off about being woken up at 2:30 a.m. as well, but that's just me. I also don't know if people get woken up that early in prison. I don't think that they do. In juvie, there were scheduled meal times, rec times, etc., but realistically, unless shit was hitting the fan, we didn't wake anybody up at that time, especially to eat. There were different cell checks done and head counts done, but that didn't require anybody to wake anyone up. So, again, not entirely sure what that's about. Probably just more psychological warfare. In response to the inmates' rebellion, guards sprayed fire extinguishers at the prisoners in an attempt to reassert control. Again, this confuses me because I don't know how they just got a bunch of fire extinguishers to use. I also don't understand the thought process of using them to regain control, because if anything, it's just going to make everything all foggy and gross, and you're not going to be able to see very well. At this point, 3 backup guards were called in to assist their coworkers, and in an ultimate power move, guards removed all the prisoners' clothes. Then they removed the prisoners' mattresses. Lastly, they sentenced the main instigators to time in the special detention unit in solitary confinement. It's interesting to me that the immediate response for the guards was to dehumanize the prisoners, to take away any sense of identity and just leave them buck naked. They created a very vulnerable state for the prisoners to be in. And on top of that, they also took their mattresses, removing legitimately any moderate amount of comfort that the prisoners had. Overall, I find it incredibly inhumane. Now, in order to rest, the prisoners basically have to lay buck naked on the cold, hard floor at this point. In a way, it's almost like making them a bunch of animals in a zoo. And the punishment, in my opinion, definitely outweighed the crime. What's interesting, too, is that these are just average guys. They have no training on how to handle these types of situations. My guess is that they saw how uncomfortable everyone was during the strip searches and then just reverted back to it as a punishment to curb what they believed was aggressive behavior. The guards also removed the only identifying features of the inmates, even if it was only a number. They essentially took the prisoners' names away and they made them a nobody, just a nameless person in a prison system. After this little rebellion, the guards attempted to dissuade any further rebellion by using what little psychological warfare they knew. Reports state that one of the guards told a colleague, quote, "These are dangerous prisoners," end quote. Keep in mind, this is only day number 2. This experiment is supposed to run a total of 14 days. We also need to keep in mind these inmates haven't actually committed any crimes, but given the emotional toll and environmental factors, this was likely forgotten. Additionally, the experiment had former prison inmates expressing what they themselves had experienced. They stated that the guards' use of psychological warfare and breaking the bonds between inmates was exactly how real-life prison worked, quoting the experiment's narration. What is reportedly done, according to their inmate consultants, is to use the threat of homosexuality to divide the prisoners and also to promote racism, which pits blacks, Chicanos, and Anglos against each other. In fact, in a real prison, the greatest threat to any prisoner's life comes from his fellow prisoners. In real prisons, it becomes each prisoner for himself, and rarely do prisoners ever get together to act in unity against the system. This concludes the quote from the experiment's narration. Due to the threat of homosexuality being something weaponized in prison, it would seem that the idea of keeping prisoners naked stems from that, and it would be seen as, quote, gay for a bunch of men to be sleeping naked in a cell together, even if it was for punishment purposes. Crazy to think that they literally weaponized homosexuality and, like, psychological warfare back in 1970, because 2026, homophobia is still a thing, but I don't think it's to that extent. So at least we've made progress in that regard. Next, we have Tuesday, August 17th, day number 3. After mulling over the initial rebellion, guards decided to separate and reward prisoners who had minor roles in the rebellion. This was a tactic for dissuading any additional rebellion. To bolster the idea of rewarding good behavior, the 3 guards on shift spent time in the, quote, good cell. They then provided the inmates with clothing, beds, and food, which they denied to the rest of the jail population. Remember, the guards were specifically told not to deprive people of food or water. That was very clear in the beginning, in their orientation. After chumming it up with the, quote, good prisoners, end quote, the guards sent the prisoners back to their old cells, which still lacked beds. This was after a 12-hour period where other inmates were deprived of basic human needs like food and water. Again, a big no-no. To make matters worse, guards had prisoners count off and do push-ups for no other reason than they wanted them to. In one instance, a guard planted their boot in the back of a prisoner and pushed it down while they performed push-ups. Guards also restricted access to the bathrooms and forced prisoners to relieve themselves in a bucket. At least in actual prison, there's toilets. But hey, buckets work too, I guess. The guards at times would even refuse to empty the buckets. It got to a point where guards would refuse to let inmates use the bathroom at all. At this point, we can see the guards resort to physical corporal punishment, a technique I suspect was used to exhaust the prisoners. If you make them too tired to fight back, then they ultimately won't fight back. It also reasserts the power dynamic at play. As for making prisoners urinate in a bucket, that can be chalked up as a way to humiliate prisoners. Now you may be thinking, we're on day 3. This really seems to confirm everything I know about the experiment and how everybody sucks and that Zimbardo was right. Just hang in there, because we're going to get to Zimbardo eventually, and you're going to probably second guess yourself on that one. Wednesday, August 18th, day 4. After the guards had established that prisoners were good or rebellious, the inmates started to distance themselves from one another. Those willing to rebel believed that other prisoners were snitches. The, quote, good prisoners considered the rebels a threat. They saw the rebels as dangerous and the reason they would lose their beds and clothes again. Interestingly enough, this sentiment would help the guards quell further disruption. They established a system where everyone wants to act in their own best interest. The guards also demolished any trust the inmates had in each other, meaning the inmates would no longer rely on one another for literally anything, and this would decrease the risk of rebellion. Thursday, August 19th, day 5. Day 5 was scheduled for visitations by friends and family where the inmates would get to visit with them. This was, again, used to simulate the prison experience. Unfortunately, Zimbardo and the guards made inmates' visitors wait for long periods of time before they could see their loved ones. This long wait was in part due to the fact that 2 visitors could see any one prisoner. The visitors' allotted visitation time was only 10 minutes, and it was required that a guard be present. During the course of these visitations, parents grew concerned about their sons' well-being, namely whether they had enough to eat. Some parents even left with plans to contact lawyers. Their goal was to gain early release for their children. Remember, they're not actually arrested. They can leave the experiment at any point in time, so this has already gone far beyond what it was supposed to. On the same day, Zimbardo's colleague Gordon H. Bauer arrived to check on the experiment. Up until this point, no one had examined what was taking place in Stanford's basement. Feels kind of like an oversight. It was a very isolated event. When Bauer saw what was taking place, he questioned Zimbardo about what the independent variable of the research was. And in case you're not super sciencey or you haven't been to science class in a while, the independent variable is what influences the dependent variable. Basically, if I want to see how quick water freezes in different temperatures, the time water takes to freeze will depend on the temperature. So the independent variable is what experiences change, and the dependent variable is influenced by this change. Christina Maslock also visited the prison and was distressed after observing the guards abusing their prisoners. Christina witnessed guards forcing prisoners to wear bags over their heads, along with them urinating in buckets, and other established horrors. Christina ultimately challenged Zimbardo about his lack of oversight and pointed at the overall immorality of the study. Christina would later state that Zimbardo had been changed by his role, just like the guards. Christina was adamant that Zimbardo, acting as superintendent of the prison, changed him into someone she did not recognize and did not like. Christina's direct challenge, as well as other concerns, led Zimbardo to end this Stanford Prison Experiment the next day. Shout out to Christina. Obviously, for some reason, it takes a woman to intercede on this. At least she had some freaking common sense. So thank you, Christina. We have Friday, August 20th, day 6, which is the final day. Due to Maslock's objections, parents' concerns, and the increasing brutality exhibited by guards, Zimbardo ultimately ended the study on day 6. Keep in mind, this experiment was supposed to cap out at 14 days total. They didn't even make it halfway. On day 6, Zimbardo gathered the experiment's participants, guards, prisoners, and researchers. He informed them that the experiment was over and arranged to pay them for their 6-day participation. Zimbardo then held a debriefing, which lasted for several hours, where everyone, both prisoners and guards, were able to share their respective experiences with one another. At this point, all participants were asked to complete a personal retrospective regarding the experiment. This retrospective was to be mailed to each individual after completion. In the end, all participants were asked to return a week later, where they would be given the opportunity to share their opinions and emotions about the events that took place. The experiment was then deconstructed, and the basement was returned to normal. In all, the test results would be highly controversial. The biggest issues presented themselves with prisoner participants 8612 and 819. As I was researching this experiment, I was uncertain if anyone had left, or as I mentioned earlier, was allowed to leave the experiment. As it turns out, prisoners 8612 and 819 were the only two that left, and here are their respective stories. Douglas Corpy, prisoner 8612, was the first to leave the experiment. Douglas lasted an approximate 36 hours in the experiment before exhibiting mental and emotional distress. At one point, he yelled out, quote, "Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside," end quote, and, quote, "I can't stand another night, I just can't take it anymore," end quote. Douglas's seemingly apparent breakdown resulted in his release from the experiment by one of the overseeing researchers. However, in an eventual 2017 interview, Douglas would claim that his breakdown was fake. He stated that he wanted to go back to studying for his graduate record exam. At the time, Zimbardo promised Douglas he would have time to study despite being a part of the experiment. This was a lie, and Douglas was deprived of educational materials. In 1992, in a documentary movie about the study Quiet Rage, Corpy asserted that the prison experiment had deeply affected him, and that experience caused him to later become a prison psychologist. However, in a 2017 interview, Corpy stated that his breakdown had been fake and that he did it only so that he could leave and return to studying. He had originally thought that he could study, as I said, while imprisoned, but the prison staff would not allow him. Douglas would later express regret that he had not filed a false imprisonment charge. In an earlier interview taking place in 1992, Douglas would state that the experiment itself had impacted him so much that, as I mentioned, he did become a prison psychologist. So these are two separate interviews where he reaffirms the series of events that happened. Zimbardo, as one would expect, contested all of the statements made by Corpy. However, the narration states, quote, "It took quite a while before we could be convinced that he was really suffering, and then we released him," end quote. This was due to the guards believing 8612 wasn't in any legitimate distress, despite documented incidents of uncontrolled crying, screaming, weeping, and disorganized thinking. Personally, I don't think that his breakdown was fake. I think he probably was in way over his head and he was trying to save face after leaving the experiment, but that's just my personal opinion. As for prisoner 819, he began showing symptoms of distress like weeping in his cell. Due to 819's emotional distress, a priest was brought in to speak with him. Despite this, 819 refused to speak with the priest and instead asked for a medical doctor. After hearing 819 cry, Zimbardo did his best to reassure 819 on what his real identity was and even went so far as to remove his prison ID. While prisoner 819 was speaking with Zimbardo regarding his mental health issues, nearby guards encouraged the remaining inmates repeatedly to cry, quote, "819 did a bad thing," end quote. It's reported that, quote, prisoner 819, end quote, broke down even more as he heard the other inmates calling him bad. In the end, Zimbardo would release 819 and gave him his allotted pay. These instances of abuse were part of the intense criticism that would plague Zimbardo's experiment, along with multiple claims of experiment supervisors directly influencing the guards. Zimbardo would ultimately decide, based on the results, that the experiment indicated people's actions were influenced by the institution they were a part of, not that they were individually evil. This was a questionable determination due to manipulation allegations of the experiment and Zimbardo's own participation in some very concerning events. For instance, there was a reported escape plan in the works amongst inmates. The idea was that 8612 wasn't actually mentally distraught and would instead return with friends to break out the other inmates. To combat this, Zimbardo went to the Palo Alto police and asked to have his inmates transferred to their jail, a real-life jail, for a fake-ass experiment. The police refused, which Zimbardo said, quote, disgusted him, end quote, due to their, quote, lack of cooperation, end quote, as if they probably didn't violate a fuck ton of policies to help him in the first place. So, instead, Zimbardo cleaned out a storage closet on the 5th floor of the building they were in, placed bags over inmates' head, and then crammed them all into the closet until the escape plan was supposed to pass. Here's an excerpt on what Zimbardo's plan was. Quote, when the conspirators came, I would be sitting there alone. I would tell them simply that the experiment was over and we had sent all of their friends home and that there was nothing left to liberate. After they left, we'd bring our prisoners back and redouble the security of our prison. We even thought of luring number 8612 back on some pretext and then imprisoning him again because he was released on false pretenses. End quote. First of all, this guy is planning to sit in the dark, like a fucking movie, and go, I've been expecting you. Like, this guy needs to get a grip of literally everything. And then second of all, he's openly admitting to the fact that he was planning to not only lure but kidnap Corpy 8612 because he believed he'd been wrongly released on false pretenses from a prison that's not actually real. So Zimbardo was willing to commit a very real crime for the sake of his experiment and had the audacity to say his results only indicated that people in power behaved inappropriately due to the institution itself. Like, no, sir, you're the head of the institution. This entire thing is in control and in your hands. You are literally the institution itself. You created it from the ground up. You realized, oh shit, I enjoyed this way too much. Let me point the finger elsewhere so that I don't look like a raging piece of shit. Newsflash, you are a raging piece of shit, and you probably shouldn't have even inserted yourself in the experiment in the first place. Zimbardo would later state, quote, "It wasn't until some time later that I realized how far into the experiment I was at that point," end quote. So again, this man is in charge of the entire situation happening. He is the reason the experiment exists. He should not be a part of the experiment, and he should be ensuring that things are running appropriately and variables are being measured. Instead, he placed himself at the head of the experiment and made himself become the experiment. This, in and of itself, is the behavior of a very egotistical man who cannot separate himself from his work. Zimbardo's participation also removed him from being an objective observer. So it's no wonder accusations about him and his undergraduate staff influencing the experiment ran rampant. On top of this, the Stanford Prison Experiment poses a lot of moral and ethical questions, namely that no one bothered to stop the experiment before it got to the point that it did. Ultimately, that choice was up to Zimbardo, but still, any number of people could have intervened, and they didn't. It doesn't help that Zimbardo pawns the guards' behavior off on external factors, stating that they could have stopped at any point in time, because I think it's important to consider the fact that in theory, yes, but Zimbardo was a well-educated, high-authority white man. These are young college kids. The onus and responsibility should have fallen on him and his staff. And instead of owning his own mistakes, Zimbardo spent decades deflecting the mistakes of his own experiment, which to me says a lot about the people involved as guards. Actually, it says less about the people involved as guards and more about Zimbardo. I think he was a man that was excited to step out of his usual role, someone who legitimately enjoyed the power he had and was able to exercise it in ways he otherwise couldn't, but he's never going to take accountability for that or the damage that was done to the students involved. Some critics of the experiment and skeptics question why the prisoners never just left the experiment, and to that I say, would you have been able to? Because they're pooping and peeing in buckets, cleaning toilets by hand, and being forced into solitary confinement. On top of that, they're also being stripped naked. Even if, in the back of their mind, they had the impression that this was all an experiment, how could they be certain that the guards also had the same belief at this point? On top of this, there were multiple accounts where other research staff would talk to the guards specifically and advise them on actions to take in order to get a more desired result with the experiment. One of the people in particular was Jaffe, who was the warden of the experiment, who realistically should have been in charge of things more than Zimbardo was, but somehow that didn't end up happening the way that it was supposed to. I'm actually gonna read kind of a debrief on what some of the issues were pertaining to, I guess you would call it priming the guards to behave the way that they did. So this is an excerpt from an article. Revelations by Zimbardo, 2007, indicate he actively encouraged the guards to be cruel and oppressive in his orientation instructions prior to the start of the study. He implied they should assert authority and even told them things like, quote, "You can create in the prisoners a sense of powerlessness. We're going to take away their individuality. They'll have no privacy," end quote. He also tacitly approved of abusive behaviors as the study progressed. Undergraduate student David Jaffe played the role of warden. He instructed the guards, quote, to stand by the cells and blow your whistles, end quote, as a way to control prisoners during the 2:30 a.m. count. Jaffe's explicit directive to a, quote, soft guard, end quote, was that every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard, which ensured the simulation seemed like a real prison. Both of these instances are cues and specific interventions in a study that should never have happened because they're coming from... So, like, Jaffe's still a researcher, right? He's almost in the exact same position that Zimbardo is. These are two people who should be objective individuals, who should be observing the research and seeing what's happening without getting involved in the first place. And to sit there and be like, I want you to be violent, I want you to break these rules, I want you to be a tough guard, goes against legitimately every scientific method that has ever existed. And so, as a whole, this study should not be given the amount of credit that it is. On top of that, some of these individuals, while they were screened at the time for mental illness, likely there were likely instances of mental illness being missed because science has progressed so much and understanding has progressed so much from then till now that there's almost a guarantee that individuals had issues that weren't noticed. On top of that, Zimbardo, once criticism got out about what Zimbardo did, how he behaved in the study, he basically went on a PR tour to speak out about how, well, it was just an accident, like I just lost myself in the experiment and this is actually scientifically valid, and it's not. It's not at all. On top of that, only using middle-class educated white men is not even remotely a representation of what prison life is like. At all. If he really wanted to simulate prison life, he would have multiple education levels, multiple ethnicities, multiple races, and that didn't happen. Honestly, at the end of the day, this entire experiment is a joke. It was a farce from the beginning. I doubt that the guards would have been as violent as they were if they weren't specifically instructed to behave that way. I'm sure there were probably a few that thought, hey, this is a heyday, I get to beat the shit out of people, but I don't think everybody would have been like that. The fact that there was a soft guard in the experiment that was specifically told he needed to stop being soft tells me pretty much everything that I need to know about that. I think there was a lot of potential with this experiment. I think there could have been a lot that was learned, but Zimbardo fucked it up so bad that another experiment like this has never been approved because he did such a shitty job. So realistically, any, not deduction, but any sort of scientific claim surrounding this study cannot be trusted, cannot be accurate, because the way the study was handled. There's too much outside influence. Also, there's no clear independent and dependent variable. He was measuring something that's super subjective and has like multiple components. It's not as easy as like watching water freeze, right? You have to get codependent variables out of the way. Like there's so much wrong with it. And it bothers me seeing people put so much weight into this because of how inaccurate it is. And I think it comes from a place of just not understanding how batshit crazy Zimbardo is, because he did such a good job on his little PR tour of being like, oh no, I was doing everything appropriately. It just got out of control. I don't know what happened, guys, as if he wasn't in charge. But yeah, Stanford Prison Experiment, absolutely insane, absolutely crazy. I kind of wish that it was handled differently because I think there was a lot to learn there. I think it hinted at some truth, but I also think that there was so much that went wrong with it that you cannot put any stock into what Zimbardo did. And to be honest, this experiment basically ruined his career. People did not take him seriously after this because he did such a piss poor job. And the fact that he was sitting there in the dark and like shoved a bunch of people who weren't actually arrested into a closet, because he was like, oh no, they're gonna escape. I mean, this dude made himself look like an absolute idiot because he is. I don't really put a lot of stock into just about anything that he researched or came up with after that. On top of that, massive ethics issues. These poor guys had their rights violated. I understand that they needed to be treated like prisoners, but at the end of the day, they weren't. And they never should have been arrested. They never should have been booked or strip searched or anything like that. So there's just so many issues with this experiment. So I caution people who go around saying, oh, well, the Stanford Prison Experiment proved this. The Stanford Prison Experiment didn't prove anything. The only thing the Stanford Prison Experiment proved was how much of a fucking idiot Zimbardo was, along with his research team. That's what ended up happening. So, that's all I have on that. Very interesting experiment. Very interesting case study of an egotistical man who cannot separate himself from his work. Personally, I think Zimbardo's quite narcissistic, but that's just me. I don't have anything else for you guys. Just something that I think is a fun deep dive, because I also think it's super important to hold researchers accountable so that they don't come up with shit like this and it just spreads a bunch of misinformation. Because really, what the Stanford Prison Experiment has become is this idea that all men are inherently violent, and if you put them in a position of power and authority, they will consequently abuse that power and that authority. And do I think there's some truth there? Yes. I think there are a lot of men who are inherently violent, and I think there are a lot of men who, when put in a position of power and authority, abuse that. However, there are so many people that do not behave that way. So many men that, if you put them as a prison guard without any training and said, hey, go be part of this experiment, I want you to beat the shit out of this other guy, would be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Because a lot of us have morals. Like, a lot of people, including men, have morals and probably just don't want to constantly beat the shit out of each other. So just things to think about when you consider the Stanford Prison Experiment and its actual impact on psychology and the scientific world. But that is all I have for you guys. So thank you for tuning in. The podcast room should be done in the next month or two, and then eventually I will move over yonder, and I'm really excited to show you that, guys. If you like this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help. I appreciate all of the support. You guys are fantastic. I can't believe we're at 425 subscribers, because that's a shit ton of people. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting me. It really does mean a lot. My goal is to just educate and spread awareness and hopefully debunk quite a bit of misinformation. But yeah, stay safe out there, take care of each other, and stay psyched out.